For this afternoon and tonight, a significant winter storm, including heavy snow with limited drinking.
Hello and welcome to the Snowbrains podcast, where it's my job to interview the most intelligent people in the snow sports industry and pass their fascinating knowledge onto you, our listeners. I'm your host, Miles Clark. I'm a professional free skier, a mountain guide, an Alaska heli ski guide, a UC Berkeley molecular cell biology graduate, the founder and CEO of Snowbrains, and we are in the middle of an 11-day storm that is forecast to continue for at least another week here in Alaska. We felt horribly lucky to have snuck out on a blue hole yesterday and stolen 6 glorious runs in deep powder snow and surreal subarctic light skiing past 7 p.m. There's truly nothing that beats Alaska.
This episode of the Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Club Med. Are you ready for an unforgettable ski getaway that takes care of everything? And I mean everything. Head to one of Club Med's mountain resorts where you can experience the thrill of the slopes without worrying about a thing. With their all-inclusive packages, you'll get all your lift tickets, ski passes, ski and snowboard lessons for all ages and ski levels, delicious meals, exciting apres-ski activities, and even childcare for the kids, all included in the price. So you can focus on what matters most, carving perfect turns and enjoying the breathtaking views. Visit www.clubmed.us or call 1-800-CLUB-MED or call your travel advisor to book your ski escape today.
My guest today is Hilary Eisen, Policy Director at Winter Wildlands Alliance. In this role, she leads the organization's policy work, focusing on the protection of wild winter landscapes and advocating for quality human-powered snow sports experiences. Her responsibilities include analyzing and responding to public land management proposals, engaging in National Forest winter travel management, and collaborating with partner organizations to advance conservation and recreation policy. The mission statement of Winter Wildlands Alliance is to inspire and empower people to protect America's wild snowscapes. Hello, Hilary. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here. How are you today?
I'm feeling good. How are you?
I'm happy. I'm happy that you're here. This is really cool. I want to learn about all this stuff because I think a lot of our listeners do, the nuts and bolts of this industry and how things happen behind the scenes and with environmental impact reports and all this stuff I think is fascinating. But I do have to ask when you skied last.
So kind of depends what kind of skiing you're talking about because my ski quiver is quite large.
Ooh, okay.
But cross-country skiing, I would have skied last weekend. Unfortunately, didn't get a chance to get out at all in any way, shape, or form over the week. My last day at a resort was the weekend before St. Paddy's Day, and backcountry skiing was probably a few days before that.
Wow, you've been all over the place. Good. All right, you're qualified. We'll move on. So, Hilary, today I really want to dive into your organization, the Winter Wildlands Alliance, and what it is exactly you good folks do there to protect our sacred outdoor spaces. It's so important to all of us who ski and ride. But first, I would love to hear your quick and dirty life story. So this can be as short as long as you want. I think it's a really cool way to connect with people. So we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it pretty short. I grew up in Montana. I still live in Montana. But I went to school in New England when I was, younger. I thought I wanted nothing to do with mountains, nothing to do with rural places. I was going to live in a big city out east. Didn't take me too long to realize that was not actually what I wanted. And as soon as I graduated, I moved back to Montana. And throughout college, I had worked on Forest Service trail crews, and I continued doing that after I graduated. But the first winter after graduating from college, I landed a job tracking wolves in Grand Teton National Park. So
wow.
Skiing in the park for work, not the part that has the Tetons, I guess. The wolves and other wildlife are more in the flat parts of the park in the wintertime. That was really cool. My first step into conservation. And so then I spent a couple years going back and forth between summertime working for the Forest Service, doing trail crew, wilderness ranger type jobs, and winter doing wildlife research. Also, that first winter in the Tetons, I decided it'd be a really good idea to teach myself how to teleski in the backcountry alone because it was something I'd heard about that seemed really cool. I did and continue to do a lot of ice climbing.
Oh, wow.
So my kind of free time when I was in college was very much spent climbing ice in the Adirondacks. Some cross-country skiing. I'd started cross-country skiing in high school, but it wasn't really until after college that I decided I was going to get into downhill skiing, and decided to go straight for the backcountry because I couldn't afford a lift ticket to Jackson or even Snow King. And I was a terrible tele skier for many, many years as a result of my approach to how I decided to learn how to do it. But at any rate, after a couple of years of the seasonal life, I stumbled into what I think of as kind of my first real job, year round, had a desk and a computer, not as fun, maybe not outside, but working for a conservation nonprofit in Cody, Wyoming, working on Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, planning and conservation. The real threat to the landscape I was working in at the time was oil and gas development. This is during the Bush administration. A little over 3 years of doing that, I decided to go to graduate school. I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a wildlife biologist or if I wanted to work in conservation policy. And two, I just decided it was time to live in a town with more young people. Cody, particularly when I was living there, was a pretty gray-haired community.
That's the middle of nowhere, too.
Well, that wasn't a problem, and it has the best ice climbing in the country, and that was really the reason I was there. Yeah, I went to graduate school in Missoula at the University of Montana, got a master's degree in wildlife biology. Very quickly realized that I actually didn't want to be a wildlife biologist. I really enjoyed the environmental policy work, but the wildlife biology degree was still a really important and helpful kind of component to the work that I wanted to do and still do. And when I graduated, I moved to Bozeman, moved here for a part-time temporary job. That job ended after 6 months. I spent the following winter just skiing powder every day, except for when I was ice climbing. It was pretty great, but also needed to find work, and was starting to think about what I really wanted to do. Realized I wanted to combine traditional conservation, grassroots organizing, environmental policy work that I had experience in with somehow connecting with the recreation community that I was part of and that I didn't see represented when I went to Forest Service meetings, and didn't really see that voice in public land management at the time. So I was trying to figure out how to make that job happen, and luckily saw a job announcement from Winter Wildlands Alliance. I wasn't familiar with the organization. I didn't really know that this field I was interested in actually already existed. And I was just like, oh, my dream job, there it is. And so that was in 2014, I think is when I started working here. Yeah, I've been here for a while.
Nice. Wow. Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you for sharing that. And I do have to ask, where did you go to school back east?
I went to Middlebury College in Vermont.
I knew it. See, I knew it was something fancy because people always do that on their show. They're like, yeah, I went to school back east. You're like, all right, where? Like, well, I went to Yale. It's like, okay, like people want to know this. And so,
well, I figure nobody's really heard of the small liberal arts school in Vermont.
Well, but it's also like,
back east. But it depends where you are, I guess.
Yeah, well, but it's also Middlebury is famous for having really high intellectual people. All right, so
and skiing.
And okay, well, and then that's the part I didn't know. So that's great, especially from if you're coming from Montana, then yeah, that's legit.
Well, I didn't go there for the skiing. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, especially coming from Montana. Well, thank you for sharing. I love that. I think it just connects our audience with you. We know a little bit about who you are and where you come from now. So, Hilary, what is the Winter Wildlands Alliance, and what are you folks focused on accomplishing?
Winter Wildlands Alliance is a national nonprofit organization that works to inspire and empower people to protect America's wild snowscapes. We're basically a conservation organization for people who care about winter, particularly skiers, snowshoers, ice climbers. We're an alliance of over 100 grassroots environmental organizations and backcountry partners. Our snow school program engages over 33,000 kids every year in science-based field trips and education across 72 different locations. We've actually had 500,000 kids go through snow school since that program began. It's awesome. And then our Backcountry Film Festival, which premieres every winter in Boise, Idaho, tours to more than 100 locations around the world and raises more than $200,000 each year for local mountain communities.
And including Antarctica, because I always see those. That's where I know you folks from, is your movies, which seems there's a handful of facets there, but it seems like one of the strategies with your film festival is awareness for what you folks do. I mean, it's like, hey, you guys like cool stuff, so do we. Check it out. And it worked for me. Like that's
yeah. I mean, our mission, has 3 key words in it, right? Inspire, empower, and protect. And so the film festival inspires people, and our policy work works to empower people to protect. And Snow school is all about kind of engaging the next generation in a love of winter,
Right, it's cradle to grave, right? You got to start it young. So
right?
that's smart. That was actually my next question. What's your focus of the schools with the kids? Well, so how many employees do you folks have?
Right now, we have 5 full-time employees and 1 part-time employee,
I love it.
and we're
That's great.
small.
Yeah, no, that's good. Snowbrains too is 5 full-time employees. How many years of operation now?
We are really excited to be celebrating our 25th year this year. We were
Wow.
founded in 2000.
Congratulations. What a great year. And how are you folks funded?
We are funded through a mix of individual donations, private foundation dollars, and then we do some fundraising events. Mostly, the Backcountry Film Festival is our big event that raises some money for us and a lot of money for our partners who use it as well.
And how about grants? Is that something that you folks are ever part of?
Yeah, so grants from private foundations. We don't have any federal funding.
That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
ask. Sorry. So, great. So yeah, all privately funded. Well, let's jump right in because the reason that you and I are talking today is you reached out and said, "Hey, I know a lot about environmental impact reports and how they affect ski resort development." So I feel like that's a critical part of your work, and we might say EIR for environmental impact reports. So
I'd
these,
actually say EIS. It's actually environmental impact statements.
okay, I'll switch.
But
I'll
it's
see. I already
totally
wrote it
cool.
out
They're
the
all
other
all
way.
means the same thing.
Okay, so EIS. These reports are essential for basically assessing how projects affect ecosystems, wildlife, communities, the whole gamut. Could you give us an overview of what goes into an EIS for a ski resort?
I will try to keep my nerd hat kind of like over
No,
here
no, we want this is a
because
nerdy
it gets
show.
real nerdy real fast.
This is a nerdy show. The people listening are by kind of de facto nerds. And if not, we screen them out quick.
So yeah, any agency, any part of the federal government that is making a decision that the technical kind of legal words here are a decision that significantly affects the human environment. And so
Mm,
that comes out of the National Environmental Policy Act, which was our first environmental law in this country. It was signed into law in 1970. It was really one of the first environmental laws in the world. It's really foundational to the world as we know it today. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, transparency in government decision making, the ability to have a say in what the government is doing, that all comes from the National Environmental Policy Act. But one of the things that law calls for is that if the government is going to make some sort of essentially major decision, they need to let the public know that they're making that decision, and they need to go through a process to gather information to inform their decisions. So it's not just totally arbitrary. And this came out of years of the government kind of making arbitrary decisions and nobody knowing about them until they were affected by it. Think about interstate highways being built and splitting communities in half, and then all of the environmental justice issues that stem from that, or environmental decisions that led to rivers catching on fire, like all the things that you hear of. So the government, in the process of making a major decision, they have to consider the environmental effects, and that's not just effects on air, water, and wildlife, but also kind of there's a socioeconomic component to that too, because local economies are tied to air, water, wildlife, the larger environment. Ski resort expansions, permitting of a new ski resort, major developments within a ski resort, all of that kind of fits the bill as like a major decision that the government would be making, assuming that the ski resort is one of the 122 resorts in the United States that operate on Forest Service land. So if it's all private land, they can do whatever they want. But if it's Forest Service land, then the Forest Service has to permit the decisions. And so it's triggered, it's called the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act process. And most of the time that leads to an environmental impact statement. There's a number of parts to it. It starts out with the purpose and need. So like, why are we doing this? And the purpose and need statement, it's basically like, Forest Service is conducting this analysis to consider whether to permit Grand Targhee Ski Resort's proposed activities. And that is not the exact purpose and need statement for that EIS. And then the need is the project proponent thinks this is important because of X, Y, and Z. That's usually how the ski area ones work. And then the whole point of the EIS is to identify and analyze different alternatives. And those are basically like, behind this door, we could do this project. Like we can achieve our purpose and need by doing this, by doing that, or by doing this other thing. And the first of those alternatives is always what's called the no action. And that's their baseline. Like if we didn't do anything, what would be the effects? And that gives you something to compare to. But there's always the no action alternative. Then there's always the proposed action, which in the case of a ski resort expansion is going to be based on the ski area's master development plan. And so every ski area that operates on Forest Service land is required by law to have what's called a master development plan, and then to renew that plan or refresh that plan every 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And so you see them, they come around pretty often, every 10 years. And it's kind of like the vision document for the ski area. It's like, this is what we want to do in the next 10 years. It's a chance for the ski area to think about how they're using public land and what their vision is and what they may want to change about their current operations. It's a way for them to communicate that to the Forest Service, so the Forest Service kind of knows what's coming, what their leasee is thinking about. And it's a way to kind of touch base with the public of like, this is what we're thinking. As I mentioned, I live in Bozeman. Bridger Bowl is my local ski area. They are going through this process right now of updating their master development plan. Ski areas pretty much always work with some sort of contractor. There's this one based out of Colorado that's called SE Group that does a lot of these master development plans, not just for ski areas, but for all sorts of resorts. But basically they work with their contractor or their consultant to like figure out what its vision is for their resort. They are not required to, but strongly encouraged. And Bridger Bowl did this to then, before they kind of submit that master development plan, to meet with the public and present it and be like, what do you guys think?
Smart.
I think that's a really important step. And I'm really glad that Bridger did that. Targhee did not do that. And that leads to some of the issues we have, I think, with the Targhee proposal. So Bridger Bowl, they had their draft MDP. They held a bunch of public meetings here in Bozeman this winter. Tons of people showed up and told the general manager what they thought of his proposal or of his vision, and for better or worse. And the next step is kind of in progress right now. But my understanding is that they will take that public feedback and make a few changes potentially to what their draft MDP was. Then the ski area is required to submit that master development plan to the Forest Service, at which point the Forest Service works with the ski area to get the MDP to a point that they can accept it. And so every national forest has a forest plan. And that's like the 30,000 foot, 30-year plan for the national forest. It lays out kind of zones the forest into like, these are areas that we're going to manage for more primitive uses all the way to like rural uses. Ski areas usually fall in the rural category. It covers everything from what parts of the forest are suitable for timber harvest to where they want to potentially build new campgrounds over the course of 30 years to what the forest wants to recommend to Congress as potential new wilderness. So when the Forest Service receives a master development plan from the ski area, they pull out their forest plan and they compare and they're like, is this possible under our forest plan? Is there anything in here that blatantly contradicts the forest plan? And if there is, then they work with the ski area to address that. And to my knowledge, maybe they don't always get there, but the ones that end up moving forward are ones that made it through that course filter of, cool, this fits with the forest plan. Doesn't mean we're going to approve it. This is not, acceptance of the master development plan is not a automatic approval of everything in the master development plan. It's just a recognition that, okay, this is your 10-year plan for the resort, and it's technically feasible under our forest plan. But for any of those, anything in the master development plan to actually be approved and therefore become real, so that chairlift could actually be built or that new run could actually be graded, it has to go through the NEPA process to be officially approved. The NEPA process, which is the environmental impact statement, that is when the Forest Service looks at the environmental impacts of the proposal, thinks about different options for those proposals, gets public input, the whole 9 yards. So the EIS has these different alternatives. First alternative is the no action. Then there's the proposed action. That's the master development plan. And then the EIS will have usually 1 to 3 other alternatives, looking at like, well, what else? What are we hearing from the public?
Who invents those alternatives?
The Forest Service, and I mentioned SE Group, the consultant that wrote the master development plan. So they actually end up doing a lot of the analysis as well, which again, I think is a little bit sketchy. But so the Forest Service, strapped for cash, pretty strapped on staff, doesn't have the resources to do the things.
Well, and maybe less so now with the current administration. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, it just got a whole lot worse. And the worst,
because I know that federal employees are being laid off. So yeah.
Yeah. So what was already a challenging situation for the Forest Service in terms of not having enough staff to do the job they're being asked to do is getting worse by the day. And so ski area expansions are really not at the top of that list if you look at Forest Service legal obligations.
Oh, it's got to
So
be
the
low
way to
priority.
so the way to get around that is you pay for the NEPA.
I was
You
just gonna
hire
say, can you? Okay.
so that's what the ski industry does is
Hmm.
they hire a NEPA consultant. 9 times out of 10, it's SE Group. It's almost always the same consultant that wrote their master development plan. There's a couple different shops in the country, but most of them are this one out of Colorado. And they come up with an agreement with the Forest Service where they're like, hey, we get you guys don't have the resources to do the NEPA. We really want to move our business forward. We're going to pay these private NEPA contractors to do the analysis. The Forest Service still kind of supervises it. They sign off on it. And I have not worked for one of these contractors, and I haven't been on the inside on like the Forest Service side. So I don't know like 100% who's doing what pieces of it, but primarily the contractor paid by the ski resort does a lot of the work. And then the Forest Service supervises that, touches base, makes sure it's going in the right direction. And at the end of the day, it's a Forest Service document. So the Forest Service, has to reach a standard that this Forest Service is willing to put their name on and stand behind. So that's who writes the alternatives. And prior to the very beginning of the EIS process is this public comment opportunity called scoping. And that is when the Forest Service, they've accepted the NDP, and then the skier is like, cool, we want to actually move forward with implementing this. And so then they have to put out a notice and intent to conduct an environmental impact statement. And that triggers a public comment opportunity. And so that's the Forest Service saying, hey, we're considering this thing. What do you think?
And
And
how
then
much power does that have?
the public legally does have a fair amount of say.
That's great.
That is changing like rapidly as we speak, thanks to the Trump administration. But
And you're saying changing
whole,
for the public
the
not
worst.
having as much power.
Yeah, in the name of efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
The efficiency for certain interests, I guess. But I digress. The whole point of NEPA was to give the public power, to make sure that the public was involved and could influence how our government works. And so the public comment periods are intended to be meaningful, but the scoping comment period, that's what drives the alternative development. So that's when the Forest Service is like, okay, this is what's been presented to us. What do you think? And then based on what they hear from the public, as well as from like the state wildlife agency, their own resource specialists, kind of a variety of different sources of input, they then take all of that information and this is the way it should work. It doesn't always work this way. They will create a range of alternatives. So like I'll use Grand Targhee expansion as an example, because this is the one I've been reading for the last week. The proposed action includes a bunch of development within the ski area's existing boundary and then 2 expansions. They want to build new lifts, new runs in 2 areas that are not currently within the ski area. So that's the proposed action. And then there's one alternative that just considers authorizing the stuff within the ski area's existing boundaries. Okay, you want to do all this stuff in your existing footprint? That's this alternative. Then there's an alternative that's that plus one of the expansion pods. And then the other alternative is like the inbound stuff plus the other expansion pod. And so across those 5 different alternatives with Targhee, we have a pretty good range of things to be thinking about and choosing from, and to be able to compare like, well, what are the environmental impacts of the full-blown expansion versus expanding into just this area or just that area, or not expanding at all and just authorizing the things within the existing footprint. I've also seen EIS alternatives for other ski areas. Snow King in Jackson a few years ago went through the same process, and their NEPA sucked. With Snow King, the Bridger Teton National Forest, their alternatives, there was the proposed action, this is what the ski area wants to do. And then they were like, for this alternative, we're going to move the gondola 10 feet to the right. Every single alternative was essentially the same, because our concern, what we didn't like about that ski area expansion, was that they expanded the ski area onto the backside of the mountain, which is like south facing, doesn't get great snow, and is also winter range for a bunch of different wildlife. And every single alternative had that in it. Every single alternative put a road right across the fall line on the front of the mountain, thus putting a road across the steepest runs on the mountain. Every single alternative had a gondola. Every single alternative had a wedding venue at the top of the mountain. And so you couldn't really compare and say, like, this is meaningfully different. This isn't telling me something about the environmental impact of that decision. And there was also no path towards which the community could have a win-win, where Snow King could develop and grow and the community concerns could be addressed. Because when people in Jackson said, well, we don't want to have a road across the fall line because that's the race course. They were like, too bad, every alternative has that in there.
Yeah, and that's odd
Go
though,
ahead.
because you mentioned the Forest Service creates the alternatives. Is that right?
This is the part that's a little bit, I don't quite know because I'm not in the room,
Uh-huh.
but the consultant that the ski area hires,
To make the master development plan.
my understanding is they, and then do the EIS or write the environmental analysis. My understanding for most cases, because the Forest Service doesn't have a ton of capacity and in many instances is not really the expert in the room on this, the consultant writes the document and then the Forest Service looks at it and is like, okay, we'll either move forward with this or we have concerns about this. And for whatever reason, the Snow King expansion, and this was a few years ago, it's built now. So it was
They haven't gone that
long
long.
ago. The process is long ago enough that the decisions were made and the chairlift and the wedding venue were there. But the Forest Service chose not to play a very strong leadership. They kind of abdicated their responsibility. My perspective of it was. But yeah, so those EIS documents, there's a lot of variety to it. There's like the letter of the law and what is technically required. And then there's the latitude that the agency has to meet that law. Part of my job is to hold the agency to a high standard so that the public and the public comment and what the public wants from their public lands is given its due in this process. Because just because it's a ski resort doesn't mean that the only stakeholder is the ski resort. Yes, there's the owner of the ski resort, there's the pass holders, whether it's a day pass or a season pass holder, they're not all in lockstep with what the owner of the resort wants at all times. And there's a lot of variety across pass holders and users of the resort. There's the summer users, the winter users, there's the people who are recreating on the national forest lands next to the ski area. There's the communities, because every ski area is somewhat close to a town, and that town is providing services that are tied to the ski areas. There's all these different stakeholders. The NEPA process is kind of the official room in which everyone talks about the future of this place, and then the federal government, because the Forest Service is the steward of the lands upon which this is all occurring. At the end of the day, they're the ones that make the decision.
Wow, that's pivotal. And I do think it's really interesting that the development group and the Forest Service work together to create the alternatives. And it sounds like almost conflicted interests in a way, but we'll move on.
This episode of the Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Club Med. Calling all skiers and snowboarders, escape to the snowy peaks of Europe, Japan, China, or Canada with Club Med. Their more than 20 all-inclusive mountain resorts offer unparalleled convenience and endless adventures. Explore world-class ski resorts, indulge in authentic gourmet dining, and unwind with lively apres-ski activities. Let Club Med take care of everything so you can simply relax and enjoy your ski getaway. Visit www.clubmed.us or call 1-800-CLUB-MED or call your travel advisor to discover your ski paradise.
So for an environmental impact statement, there's the master development plan that is proposed by the ski resort. We can potentially say Grand Targhee. And then there's the forest plan. They kind of see how those mesh. Then there's the scope phase. Then the EIS comes out with alternatives. And then there's an approval or denial. Who approves or denies? Or I guess the EIS isn't approved or denied, right? It's just the EIS. And then there's approval or denial of the project, I guess, of one of the alternatives.
The EIS is to analyze the project and then to come up with the ultimate decision. And so
Mhm.
the EIS, you start out with your proposed action, which is generally like what the ski area wants. And then you look at a handful of alternatives, and then public comment opportunities, and Forest Service and the contractor are analyzing those opportunities, those different comments and different alternatives. And then generally what they do is they come up with, sometimes they will approve the final decision will just be one of those alternatives. More often than not, it's a modified version of any one of the alternatives. Like basically, as long as, like, kind of think of it as like an a la carte menu. As long as you're picking from the menu, you can mix and match and create whatever delicious meal you want at the end of the day. And so they pull from all the different alternatives. Usually the decision is pretty closely resembles one of those alternatives, but it might have elements from the others. And then that's what's called the draft decision. They publish, that's kind of the next step after there's the scoping period, public comment, and then there's the draft environmental impact statement, also public comment. And then there's the draft decision / final environmental impact statement. That's more of an objection opportunity. And then after all of that, then there's the final decision. Person who makes that decision is a Forest Service person.
It's
Sometimes
one person.
one person who usually is taking input from their staff and the public. But at the end of the day, somebody makes a decision. And
Wow.
that is almost all the time in a project of this magnitude, it's the forest supervisor. End of the day, there's an approved record of decision. That's basically saying, okay, ski resort, these are the things you're allowed to do. Sometimes things will be approved and then they don't actually, this is true with Targhee. The Forest Service had approved a new chairlift, the Coulter chairlift, years and years and years ago. And they just built it 2 years ago. It's not like you have to go out and do everything tomorrow. The idea is to give the ski area some space to say, okay, these are the things you're allowed to do, maybe ideally within the 10-year time frame of your master development plan, but that's not really required. And then it's up to the ski area as to like when they're going to build that chairlift or put in that new snowmaking system or put in the new outhouse or whatever. The decision doesn't say you have to do this and then that and then this other thing. Like that is all up to the ski area. But they can't do projects that are not within that decision. That would require a whole other NEPA process.
So Grand Targhee Resort in Wyoming just recently released an EIS for its expansion plans. And so what are your thoughts on this project? And are there any specific concerns or positive aspects worth highlighting?
Yeah, so the Grand Targhee draft EIS is available for public comment until June 20th, which
Okay.
feels like, oh, we have so much time, but that time's
Mhm.
going to go fast. We had 90 days total from when they published it. There are 5 alternatives in there. There's the ski area's proposed action, and what the ski area is asking for is permission to expand into Teton Canyon, and then also to expand below the ski area, this area called Mono Trees, and then to
Mhm.
develop a bunch of stuff within the existing ski area boundaries. Real high level, we don't really have a problem with them developing more stuff within their existing boundaries. And there's the majority of their proposal is within the existing boundaries. New Nordic trails, mountain bike trails, some new lifts, new terrain, glading, visitor facilities, like a ton of stuff within their existing footprint. And we're fine with that. What we don't support is Targhee expanding its footprint. And the 2 places that they want to expand are pretty different from each other. Like it's not like, I had a reporter ask me the other day, like, well, if you had to choose, which one would you choose? And I was like, we aren't choosing either of them. We have different reasons for being opposed to them. Generally, I would say, we can support what's called alternative 3, which is the one that doesn't authorize expansion, but does authorize a bunch of stuff within the existing boundaries. I am still reading the EIS. It's very lengthy and very detailed.
How long is it?
And the EIS is 600 and some pages, but
Oh,
then there's a
wow.
whole other library of supplemental reports, which are also really
Like
important.
appendix and all that.
And there's
So
an
it's like
art to
it could be
reading,
1,000 pages.
but there's an art to reading it. I will not read
Okay.
every single page word for word. Part of my job is like reading these really big documents and creating a Cliff Notes version of them and sharing that back out with our membership. So we are working with some local partners to hold community meetings in Jackson and in Driggs in May. And so I have to have this stuff dialed by then because we're going to be talking about it and presenting the Cliff Notes version and answering questions for people in May. So I better know what I'm talking about by then.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're generally supportive of alternative 3. I have some concerns even within that within inbounds. They're saying they're going to really increase snowmaking. They're going to build a handful of new restaurants, but there's not a lot of detail around the water that would support all that. So snowmaking, obviously, you have to have a lot of water. They're talking about drilling wells, and it's, well, the state of Wyoming would authorize the wells. And it's like, well, how do you know that the water's that? It doesn't make sense to like approve all this stuff without actually knowing if you're going to get the approval to drill the well.
Yeah.
It seems like you're putting the cart before the horse there. And then same with the restaurants. There's not what I've read so far in the EIS, and I might have missed this, like I'm still reading it, but there's not a lot of information on the water that would supply the restaurant. You're going to have hand washing, dishwashing, food prep, and there's not a lot of information on the water that would go into the restaurant or what they would do with the wastewater coming out of the restaurant. So those are questions we have, but again, in general, we don't have a problem with the ski area doing ski area stuff within its existing boundaries, but we don't want to see them expand.
And have you had any time to review the proposed development of Palisades Tahoe in California, or are there any other potential ski resort developments that you have a little bit of knowledge around?
So I've not been tracking the Palisades Tahoe one. It seems like there's just a gazillion ski area projects at any given time, and this used to be something I worked on.
Yeah.
It's kind of like becoming an ever-growing piece of my work that I'm always like, I don't really want to work on this, but nobody else does. But I've been tracking Taos. They just the Forest Service just approved proposal at Taos, and we had
And that's
concerns
Taos,
about
New
that.
Mexico, just for
Yeah,
our
New
listeners.
Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a local grassroots group down there, and we were also working with a watershed group. And there was a lot of really significant concerns. And they weren't proposing an expansion of their footprint, but they're proposing, and I guess just got approval for building a gondola from one side of the mountain to the other, or like from the front side to the back side. And a bunch of stuff, a ton of new snowmaking and other things. And there's a lot of concern about impacts with all the new snowmaking that's being authorized, a lot of concern about impacts to the Rio Hondo watershed. And backcountry skiers are really concerned about how all this development of the resort is going to affect backcountry access to the Wheeler Peak Wilderness, which is really popular.
Awesome terrain.
The historical trailhead that everyone always uses to get into the wilderness in the winter is not entirely on public land, but it was always fine. And the trail that people have always taken, the Forest Service and the ski area are trying to get people to take this different trail that the ski area wants people to take. But in the winter, it doesn't really make any sense to take that trail because it cuts across a bunch of black diamond ski runs where they're doing avalanche mitigation, and it just doesn't work for backcountry skiing. And so our local group down there, Taos Mountain Alliance, has been fighting hard to maintain the historic access to the Wheeler Peak Wilderness that backcountry skiers have always used. And those concerns were completely ignored by the Forest Service in that process. I actually could have used the Taos example as kind of bad NEPA. I talked about Snow King, but the environmental assessment we saw for Taos was similar to the Snow King one. So that's one I've been tracking. I'm also, Cooper in Colorado is very early in the process. So they've created their master development plan, and it was just accepted by the Forest Service. But we haven't actually started the NEPA process on that yet. So we're at the very beginning. They updated their master development plan as required. The Forest Service accepted it, but the Forest Service has some significant reservations in what's being proposed. And they have outlined those as, okay, like this is technically possible maybe in our forest plan. Like it's not like there's no outright do not pass go, stop here problems, but areas that they're seeking to expand into are really important habitat for Canada lynx, which is an endangered species that reintroduced to Colorado, and the area that Cooper wants to expand into, or one of the areas, there's documented female lynx having kittens. There's
cute.
like denning habitat, and that's not compatible with a ski area. So that's a red flag and something that will definitely need to be addressed and considered in the NEPA process. And then there's also concerns around impacts to different types of riparian areas, particularly fens, which are kind of a unique, ancient, I would say, riparian feature on the landscape, and really susceptible to, you're building a new chairlift, you're really compacting the ground. And even if there's not a road, when you're all done with it, you've got to have a road to get the chairlift in there to begin with. The point of the NEPA process is to dig into these questions and look at what the environmental impacts truly are, give the public a chance to understand the issues, provide any input they may have. Maybe there'll be a lynx biologist that gets involved in the NEPA process and can say, hey, these are what I see out of this, and here's a way to solve these problems, or some options that could be considered. So that's all to come. That's very early in the process. We were very involved. The Superior National Forest in Minnesota went through this whole NEPA process to consider whether or not Lutsen Mountain Ski Area would be allowed to expand onto national forest land, because Lutsen is entirely on private and maybe state land currently. And they wanted to expand onto this area called Moose Mountain, which happens to be the best backcountry ski terrain in the state of Minnesota.
Ooh.
Arguably some of the only backcountry ski terrain in the state of Minnesota. And the Forest Service denied that proposal. After several years of going through this NEPA process, ultimately the Forest Service determined that if Lutsen were to expand into that area, it would violate treaty rights that the Ojibwe hold with the United States government. That was a problem. And also there is kind of a significant impact to backcountry skiing, because there's not a lot of other places to backcountry ski in Minnesota. So pretty happy with that, because that was something, that we have a local grassroots group there as well, Superior Highland Backcountry, that they were like, hey, we have a vision for this place too. And it's to facilitate a cool hut-to-hut experience across Superior's North Shore. So yeah, those are some of the ones that come to mind. Jackson Hole Mountain Resort, they're gearing up. They've kind of been proposing some summer season stuff so far, which I try not to get involved in. But honestly, ski areas, it's maybe, if I'm being generous, 10% of what I do. And there's no way I can.
And then
I would love to have somebody at Winter Wildlands who just focused on ski area stuff, but we don't. So,
well, and then
so we
what's the
can't cover
other,
them all.
and then what's the other 90%?
So most of what I do is Forest Service land management. So ski area management is part of that, but pretty small piece. Bigger picture is I mentioned forest plans. And so the Forest Service is rewriting those forest plans. Most forest plans are about the same age I am. We were all born in the 80s. So they're pretty out of date. And so the Forest Service is slowly updating all of its forest plans. And so national forests that are important for backcountry skiing, which is a lot of them, we get involved in those forest plan revisions. And I work to make sure that backcountry skiers are aware of forest plan revision process and that the Forest Service is aware of the value of that forest for skiing and what those values are, and make sure that those values are represented in the new forest plan, whether that's zoning certain areas for non-motorized winter use or recommending certain places for conservation designations or recreation emphasis areas or things like that. Again, thinking like big picture Forest Service management. We also get really involved in a type of recreation planning called over snow vehicle use designation planning, which sounds super nerdy and dry, but it's basically like deciding where snowmobiles and other over snow vehicles are allowed to go in the winter.
Right, because I know there's a big controversy in Yellowstone, right?
So that's a little different. That's a national park, but yeah.
Okay.
So this was something Yellowstone went through. Oh gosh, I feel like I was a kid when this happened, but Yellowstone has a winter use plan that sprung out of similar to national forest, where there wasn't really regulation on how snowmobiles could be used in the national park. And it's a surprisingly popular place in the winter. It's a really magical place in the winter. And so there were thousands and thousands of two-stroke snowmobiles going into Yellowstone every day.
Crazy.
And then there was not every person doing this certainly was a problem, but there are certain individuals who were chasing bison with their sleds
Right,
and leaving the road and kind of just being bad. Plus all of that two-stroke exhaust in West Yellowstone in particular is like super cold in the winter, and the two-stroke exhaust with the really cold air was creating a major air pollution concern where like park rangers had to wear gas masks.
No way.
So many,
because I'm sure
like,
there's
the amount of
inversions.
exhaust. Yeah. So the amount of exhaust at the entrance station was so bad. And so like something had to be done. Winter Wildlands was really involved in this. I was probably still in high school at the time, honestly. Like this was a while ago. But they came up with a management plan for snowmobiles in Yellowstone. And now like taking winter trips into the park, and there's still a ton of snowmobiling, but they're 4-stroke machines. So way less pollution, way quieter. You're required to stay on the groomed road, so no more chasing animals. It's really, the motorized use is like it is in the summer. It's really predictable. So the animals, they know it's there. They don't really care because they're habituated to that really predictable use. And there's a limit to how many machines can go into the park every day. Forest Service is a little different because, of course, there's cross-country snowmobiling, off-trail snowmobiling on Forest Service land. That's a great use in the winter. It's a really important user group and use, but it's also really important for Winter Wildlands Alliance and our constituents and many other groups that there be places that snowmobiles don't go national forests, so that there are places that skiers can go. I know some pretty fast skiers, but I don't know anyone who can ski faster than a snowmobile. And it used to be that when snowmobiles weren't as powerful as they are now, there was kind of a natural separation between skiers. We could go through thick forests or up steep areas or through deep snow, and the snowmobiles just couldn't get there. So we still had our non-motorized areas. But now there's literally nothing that you can't get to on a machine.
You should see what we see. I'm a healthy ski guide in Alaska.
Yeah.
They almost can get to anything we can get to now. With
and
I don't know anything about snowmobiles, but they say the turbo snowmobiles, they can just go anywhere. It's really impressive.
Yeah, and so we can't rely on just a technological separation to make sure that there's places that have motorized recreation and places that have non-motorized recreation. It takes planning. And there's also just way more people now. And you have probably seen like the number of people backcountry skiing and snowmobiling everywhere is like way higher than it used to be.
And I got to ask this question. This is in my question line too. Is the backcountry getting busier in the USA? I asked this to everybody in your genre, and they all say, well, we don't have numbers on it, but we're trying to get better numbers. And a lot of them say, we're tracking this kind of secondhand de facto from backcountry gear sales have gone way up. And so how do you folks, not to interrupt too much, but how do you folks track that? Is it getting busier? And if it is, how are you monitoring that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in line with every other person you've talked to.
I knew it.
Based on personal experience and talking to tons of skiers all the time, yes, it is getting busier. If you
Mhm.
look at gear sales, Snow Sports Industry Association puts out their annual reports, and those are based
Mhm.
primarily on gear sales. Yes, there are more people. The gear has become way easier to use. My AT setup now versus my Telly setup when I first learned to ski, it's probably weighs half as much.
It's night and
It's
day.
way easier
Mhm.
to put the skis on, take the skis off.
Better performance.
Yeah. Backcountry skiing has become this cool thing. It's not just like this weird old hippie dirtbag thing anymore. It's like everybody, and Bridger Bowl is my local resort, and I swear people just have backcountry gear because it looks cool.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you
I feel
know,
the same.
and so yes, backcountry, I feel pretty confident saying it's getting busier. You can track snowmobile sales. That's
Yeah.
something to register your snowmobile. And that one's an interesting one because I think nationally the sales are going down. Like Yamaha, I think it was Yamaha, or no, Arctic Cat. I just heard this on NPR the other day. One of those two, or maybe both of them, they're not making snowmobiles anymore,
Oh, whoa.
like because the market is down. Skidoo is still
Interesting.
making snowmobiles, but in certain places, I think snowmobiling is increasing, and it's the places generally where there's also a lot of skiing. So, like
Mhm.
maybe nationally the numbers are going down, but in your kind of iconic backcountry areas, they're holding steady. And then there's a crossover too. Like people aren't just one thing or another thing. And so it's getting busier, but there isn't a good report digging into those numbers. And I've talked to a few different economists about like, how do we get that figured out? And it would
Mhm.
be, if anyone has a few $1,000,000 and wants to answer this question, have them call me, because that's how much it's going to cost to really answer the question, because it's really hard to track backcountry users. It's easy to track how many people ski at ski areas because you have to buy a lift ticket. But even with snowmobiles, certain states don't require you get like a permanent registration for your sled. Depending where you're taking it, you maybe don't have to have an annual sticker. So it can be really challenging. And skiers, good luck figuring out how many backcountry skiers there are, right?
Yeah.
And so
Elusive.
to really answer that question would take a lot of field work, and that's going to cost a lot of money, and then probably a bunch of statistical modeling to extrapolate from the field work. And so we don't have good numbers.
And so why is busier a good thing and why is it a bad thing?
Well, I think it's a good thing because skiing is awesome, right? It's amazing. And not even just skiing, snowboarding, playing in the snow with your kids. We want to see people enjoying public lands in the winter. It shouldn't be some sort of exclusive club that only people who learned about it 10 years ago get to play. It's no secret that snow sports are predominantly white and upper class,
Oh yeah.
middle to upper class, like they're rich white people, right? Or at
Hmm.
least comfortable white people. And
Yep.
that's not America. America is a really diverse place. I know we're not allowed to say
Mhm.
that word anymore, but this is a country with people from tons of different backgrounds, and America's public lands belong to everybody. Whether you live in Bozeman, Montana, or Nashville, Tennessee, these lands belong to you, and more power to you if you want to come check them out in the wintertime. And
Mhm.
so I think the fact that the backcountry is getting busier speaks to the fact that more people are discovering the joy of winter. And that's a really special and awesome thing. The downside of the backcountry getting busier is that because historically not a lot of people were out in the wintertime, the Forest Service in particular, which is where most winter recreation occurs, the Forest Service has never really put a lot of work or thought into managing winter recreation. And so if you think about in the summertime, there's trail crews, there's rangers, there's like a lot of people in uniform and like official
Mhm.
people out and about.
Yeah, it's very regulated in the summertime.
Yeah.
It does,
And
feels the
there's just like
opposite
there's
in winter.
people there to answer questions, people there
Yeah.
to pick, there's trash pickup, the outhouses are open.
Pamphlets and
There's just some hand holding. And there's picnic areas. There's places if you want to go and like hang out with your family, here's a place you can do it. And in the winter, there's none of that. I mean, I shouldn't say none. There are some places where there's some winter recreation staff, but for the most part, there's not like the number of people who work for the Forest Service in the winter versus the summer is not even comparable. Generally, the only place is summer. There's a lot of places to park and access national forest land. In the winter, you're really constricted by where there's plowing.
yeah.
And the question of who plows what, when, and where is different in every single place.
Oh yeah.
Um,
County
so,
by
like,
county.
yeah, and across the board, for the most part, the Forest Service isn't in the business of plowing. Plowing
Mhm.
happens because it's a snow park and the state does it, or it's a road leading up to a private subdivision, and so whoever the neighbors are paying to plow the road happens to plow the Forest Service trailhead too, because they don't want people parking on the side of their road and blocking their access, or some local club pays for plowing. Like, it's all over the map. And then everyone's restricted to those few places that are plowed, most of which are going to be snowmobile parking lots. Is that a great place to take your kids sledding?
Yeah.
No, not for you and your kids, and not for the snowmobilers who are just trying to get their rig unloaded so they can go sledding, or different kind of sledding, right?
Hmm.
So as we have more and more people coming into the backcountry, it's great, but we also need management, which we have historically not had. And that's where this winter travel planning that Winter Wildlands is really involved in. It's really the only tool the Forest Service has to start thinking about managing winter recreation.
One of the other positives I've thought of, and that's a common thought as well, is that more people in the backcountry leads to more advocacy potentially, right? So these are more people who care about these lands, care about conservation, care about protecting our public spaces that we can use for winter recreation. And just being a Lake Tahoe person, I've really seen that on the west shore of Lake Tahoe. We have all these problems you're talking about. We don't have enough spots for people to park. Sometimes they plow it, sometimes they don't. In a way, it's good because it limits how many people can be out there, but it's definitely been a big point of contention. And you get shuttles and all these kind of things, but it's mostly just the Wild West out there. I call it the West Shore Olympics, like
Yeah,
extreme
well, and
four-wheel driving, extreme digging, extreme hiking, avoiding Caltrans people, avoiding getting a ticket. Like, it's pretty interesting.
Well, and in response to everything you just described, it feels like just a few years ago, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been at Winter Wildlands for frickin' ever. But Tahoe Backcountry Alliance came into
Yes.
existence,
Yeah, they've been
in the
great.
time since I've been at Winter Wildlands, and they're one of our grassroots partners. And so
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned, we have 34 grassroots groups working
Mm-hmm.
across 17 different states. Tahoe Backcountry Alliance is a great example of that, where they're essentially a chapter of Winter Wildlands Alliance. We support them, they support us. But with our 5 staff and a national focus, we can't be in the weeds on every single local issue everywhere they're skiing. And so that's where our grassroots network really comes in. And Tahoe Backcountry Alliance has really stepped up and organized the ski community. So when Caltrans needs to figure out how to communicate with skiers, they actually have an entity they can talk to now. Like, that's so
Yes.
important.
Huge.
One reason that skiers are often not at the table in decision making, whether it's county, state, federal government, is because they don't know, if there's not a local chapter of Winter Wildlands Alliance or a Nordic Ski Club or Winter Wildlands itself, what are they going to do? They're going to talk to that skier, and maybe they're going to say completely opposite things, right? So getting organized, having representation in the ski community is really important. And because skiers in Tahoe organized into Tahoe Backcountry Alliance, they were then able to negotiate some plowing and some access and solve some of those access concerns. They were able to set up shuttles. They're doing great work down there.
I
And
agree.
there's still a ton of work to do.
I agree on both fronts. And then I guess it's a good, shout out to anybody who does have a backcountry skiing community that might not have a representation like this. You will get better results if you organize in this way. And reaching out to Winter Wildlands Alliance is probably a great place to start to see what your options are and figure out what could work for you folks in your area. So, and I think that has been big for us. And because it is getting more popular, we're seeing more people out there. So there's just a lot more going on than there used to be. So it does make sense to organize. I've been really happy because anytime I have a thought or an idea or I see something, I can write a message to the Tahoe Backcountry Alliance and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing today, just for your reporting, for your information, and they can help create solutions, which has been awesome. I also really like some of the messaging I saw. It might have been more back in the COVID era, but you guys basically saying ski kind, be kind in an ever increasingly busy backcountry. Why did you put this message out there?
Yeah, you're correct that first popped up during the COVID era, when suddenly all sorts of people who maybe were doing other things for fun realized that, well, the only thing I can do to get out of my house now is to go outside. So, I don't think COVID created new trends in outdoor recreation, but it certainly accelerated the existing trend of, we were already seeing growing use, and then it hit the gas pedal. And COVID happened, the lockdowns were in March. And so it was really summertime that people were like, holy, what are we going to do? We need to educate all these new users to public land and public spaces about how to behave. And so first there was this idea of recreate responsibly. And that messaging really took off, and Winter Wildlands was involved in that. And that was pretty summer focused, still is pretty summer focused. When that first COVID winter rolled around, we reached out to the Recreate Responsibly Coalition, and we were like, hey, we need to tweak this language for winter because there's just different issues in the winter time. Some things are the same, some are different. So we worked with Recreate Responsibly to create a winter edition. But we realized there was still kind of a gap there in how to message to the winter community to make sure we could all get along. So Ski Kind was born out of that. Winter Wildlands Alliance and Granite Backcountry Alliance, which is our New Hampshire and Maine based grassroots group. Those guys were trying to think of like some sort of code of ethics that could be used across different places in New England as they were working to establish uphill policies at ski resorts. What's the code of conduct that people can sign that will be like, I'm not going to be a jerk. I'm going to follow your rules. And we kind of like came to us with that idea, and it grew into Ski Kind, which is very all encompassing of like all the things you could be doing in the winter. And it's not just skiing, but that's the word we settled on. And the underlying premise is don't be a jerk. Be
like
nice
that.
to people. We can fit more people into the backcountry if we're nice to each other. And if we follow the rules and we're respectful. Like it's worded more eloquently than that. I was clearly not part of the wording committee, but that's the underlying premise. It's just like, be nice. And if we're all nice, this is what we learned in kindergarten, right? Like be nice to people, get along, and then we can play with, like we can share our toys.
No, absolutely. And I think that is a great message. And any chance I get to propagate it, I do my best to do so. And this is a great place for that because I think it's critical out there. I think there's so many reasons that people could be unpleasant, but I think the overreaching ideology is, hey, we're all doing the same thing. How different is someone who backcountry skis from you? Not very different. So we're all kind of the same people doing the same thing. So yeah, I think it's a great idea to be kind, respect each other, and have a good time when you're out there. Well, I think we really nailed the EIR. I really like the idea that we got into Targhee, we got into, was it Luton in Minnesota?
Luton, yeah.
And then and a couple of the other spots that we talked about, see where they are in this process. It's fascinating. Basically feel like you have a legal degree. Maybe you should go to law school too. I don't think it'd be difficult for you. And
Well,
so,
yeah, I joke I'm not a lawyer. I have friends who my legal brain lives in other people's heads.
I love that though, but going through we never had a show about legality. So that is really cool to see how that all works, learn more about how it works. It's a huge process, takes years, and it's confusing. So to break it down a little bit here today, I think was really great for our listeners. It was great for me. I learned a ton. Do you have anything you'd like to add here at the end of the show before we part ways?
Want to stress the importance of the ski community getting organized. I
Mm.
can't do my job if local skiers aren't organized, and my job is to represent skiers in public land management. But there's no way I can know what's important and what's happening across every place in the country. And so I rely on our grassroots groups. We have a great grassroots network, and go to our website and look it up. And if there's a grassroots group in your neighborhood, your community, get involved with them. And if there's not one, gather your ski partners and reach out to me. And like part of my job is helping those grassroots groups get established. And it's not an investment of time more than anything. If you're passionate about skiing, passionate about public lands, bring the two together and make sure the ski community has a seat at the table in how our public lands are managed.
And how else could we help as our listener base here, Winter Wildlands Alliance?
Become a member of Winter Wildlands Alliance. As we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, our funding comes from individual donations. It's all private funding. The more members we have, the more funding we have, which means we can hire more staff, we can cover more things. And also our work is driven by our membership. Like I don't just sit at my desk and like scheme on what I think is best for the backcountry ski community. I'm constantly talking to people all over the country about what's happening in your community, what's important, what does Winter Wildlands need to be aware of, how can we help, here's the resources we have. And so we're very membership driven.
Fantastic. Well, great. Well, make sure you go to Winter Wildlands Alliance, check out what they're doing, become a member, and organize because this is the big theme that, we learned this when we talked with the CEO of Protect Our Winters, who I'm sure you guys work with as well, is, if we all have a voice, if we all stack our hands, that's when we have power. And so let's keep doing this. Let's keep advocating for our special winter recreational spots and any outdoor spot actually for recreation. So again, thank you so much, Hilary, for your time and energy today. I really appreciate you and your expertise. I learned a ton and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Miles. It was great talking to you and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much for listening to the Snowbrains podcast. If you like this podcast, please share with friends and family and please make sure to subscribe. To find out more about Snowbrains, please visit us at snowbrains.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and more. This episode of the Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Club Med. Ditch the hassle and embrace the freedom of an all-inclusive ski vacation with Club Med. Their resorts in the European Alps and Canada offer the perfect blend of exhilarating skiing, exceptional service, and worry-free pampering. Enjoy having lift tickets, delicious meals, lessons for all ages, and endless apres-ski fun, all included in one price. While the kids are having a blast at the supervised children's clubs, you can focus on mastering your skiing skills and creating unforgettable memories on and off the slopes. Visit www.clubmed.us or call 1-800-CLUB-MED or call your travel advisor to experience skiing without limits. This episode of the Snowbrains podcast was edited by Liam Abbott, music by Chad Crouch, and I'm your host, creator, and director, Miles Clark.